Hello, this is Jeff at Mississippi in the Civil War. Hope this finds you well this 4th of July. And I wanted to do something special. I had mentioned previously that I wanted to do a longer piece on the Siege of Vicksburg. And I thought, what better way to really illustrate the impact that the Siege of Vicksburg had on the participants than to illustrate a diary from one of the Confederate soldiers who actually fought in the Siege of Vicksburg. And so this presentation is based on the diary of William L Faulk, who served in the 38th Mississippi Infantry. And I call this presentation, "This Terrible War is Still Going On," the diary of William L Faulk, 38th Mississippi Infantry. Now, I didn't just pick the 38th Mississippi out of a hat. I'm very well acquainted with this regiment. My master's thesis at Mississippi College was on the 38th Mississippi Infantry. And then after I graduated, I turned my thesis into a book called Beneath Torn and Tattered Flags, A History of the 38th Mississippi Infantry, CSA. So this is a unit I'm very well acquainted with. I had several relatives that fought in this regiment, which is where my initial interest came from. I have researched them for many years now, and I have a great interest in anything pertaining to the regiment. But this particular diary, I think, really illustrates what it was like to go through the Siege of Vicksburg day by day, just the grueling nature of the siege and how it wore down all of the men that participated in it. And to begin with, just a little background. In the spring of 1903, William T. Rigby, who was chairman of the Vicksburg National Military Park Commission, wrote to William L. Faulk of Fayette, Mississippi, asking if he had any written records of his participation in the Siege of Vicksburg. And Rigby was seeking such narratives from hundreds of soldiers who had fought in the Vicksburg campaign, both Union and Confederate. Because as part of the Park Commission, it was his job to make sure all of the monuments and markers were in their correct places. As you can see in this picture, this is a modern picture in the military park showing the Shirley House, the Illinois monuments, a lot of the position markers for the various units, and even a bust of William T. Rigby himself, which is in the park. But all of these position markers had to be very carefully located to be as close to where they were supposed to be, or where the units had been during the siege, as possible. And so Rigby was working very hard, contacting hundreds of veterans all over the country, trying to get their reminiscences and diaries and letters so that all of these markers and monuments could be accurately placed in the park. And so on April 17, 1903, Faulk responded to Rigby and said in his letter, "You have been correctly informed. I did keep a diary of events that came under my observation, but that was only what took place in our own regiment, and as such other matters of interest that I could hear. You must know that a captain in the ditches has very little time or opportunity of knowing anything but what came under his personal observation." And fortunately, along with this letter, Faulk sent in a typewritten copy of his diary for the use of William T. Rigby. And that is very fortunate because the original diary has been lost, and the only surviving copy is the one in the collections of the Vicksburg National Military Park. And when the war broke out, William Larkin Faulk was a 31-year-old planter living in Port Gibson, Mississippi. And this is a wartime engraving of Port Gibson. Really is a beautiful little town, and still is. If you've never been, I highly recommend going, as it is a gorgeous little town. And Faulk and his wife Elizabeth had 3 children, Emily, Alfred, and Henry, all of whom were under the age of 5. And Faulk was a very wealthy man. On the 1860 census, he listed the value of his real estate at $3,000 and his personal estate at $18,000. But when the war broke out, Faulk did enlist. On March 19, 1862, he joined the Van Dorn Guards at Rocky Springs, Mississippi. And this is actually a picture that I took at Rocky Springs a few years back. And this is the Rocky Springs Methodist Church, which is the only surviving uh, uh, original public building from the town of Rocky Springs. It was a thriving town up until the Civil War, but in the years after the war, it fell on hard times, and the yellow fever epidemic of 1878 really kind of sealed the town's fate. And the Rocky Springs Church is really all that's left of what was once a thriving community. But at the time of the war, it was still a very going concern, and the Van Dorn Guards were raised at Rocky Springs on March 19th, 1862. And the unit was subsequently designated as Company B of the 38th Mississippi Infantry. And Faulk was initially a second lieutenant in Company B. He was promoted to first lieutenant on July 15, 1862, and then to captain of the company on September 24, 1862. He was wounded in the attack on Corinth, Mississippi in October 1862, and he did recover from his wounds and returned to the regiment. When the 1863 campaign for Vicksburg started, the 38th Mississippi was stationed at Snyders Bluff, which was just north of Vicksburg. And shown here is a period illustration done by Frederick B. Schnell for Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper. It's from the edition of August 22nd, 1863. And this shows Snyders Bluff in the background. But the 38th Mississippi was stationed at Snyders Bluff along with their brigade. And the 38th Mississippi belonged to the brigade of this man, shown in the picture, inset picture here, Brigadier General Lewis Hebert. And Hebert's brigade, in addition to the 38th Mississippi, included the 3rd Louisiana Infantry, the 21st Louisiana Infantry, the 36th, 37th, 43rd Mississippi Infantries, and the 7th Mississippi Infantry Battalion. Hebert's brigade was assigned to the division commanded by Major General John H. Forney, and it was charged with defending the area north of Vicksburg. Thus, when the pivotal battles leading up to the siege of Vicksburg took place, the 38th Mississippi and all of the regiments in their division, for that matter, were not engaged. They were still stationed at Snyders Bluff north of Vicksburg. So they missed out on the battles of Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill. After the Confederate loss at Champion Hill on May 16th, the order came from General John C. Pemberton for Forney's division to leave Snyders Bluff and enter the defenses at Vicksburg. And they were going to have to march fast to make it to Vicksburg ahead of the victorious Union Army. General Hebert received the order to move to Vicksburg at 11 a.m. on May 17th, and he very quickly ordered his men to gather up what supplies they could, and they destroyed everything that they couldn't carry. By 7:30 p.m. that night, they were on the march, and they began the 12-mile trek to Vicksburg. They marched through the night and arrived in Vicksburg at 2:30 a.m. on May 18th. Once they were in Vicksburg, Hebert's brigade was ordered into the earthworks in rear of the city, charged with defending the section of the line between the Graveyard and Jackson roads. And Hebert deployed his brigades in the following order from left to right. You had the 36th Mississippi Infantry in the Stockade Redan, which was the brigade left. And it was a large earthwork fort guarding the Graveyard Road entrance into Vicksburg. Next came the 7th Mississippi Battalion, followed by the 37th Mississippi, then the 38th Mississippi, then the 43rd Mississippi, then the 3rd Louisiana, holding a redan on the north side of the Jackson Road, and then the 21st Louisiana, anchoring the brigade right flank in the Great Redoubt on the south side of the Jackson Road. And shown here is a picture I took a few years back showing the position held by the 38th Mississippi in the Vicksburg National Military Park. They held this position from May until June 2nd, when they were going to be moved to a different position in the line. The regiment's left would have been near this marker that is shown in the picture, with the line stretching off toward the trees in the distance. And the diary of William L. Faulk begins on May 18th, 1863, and his first entry in the diary records the following. He said, "Left the camp on Chickasaw Bayou last night and went into the entrenchments in the rear of Vicksburg. For the last 2 weeks I have heard nothing from home. My anxiety is very great. Skirmishing commenced about 1 o'clock today. 2 guns of the enemy artillery firing. 6 o'clock, heavy skirmishing on the left of our line." And Falk had very good reason to be worried about his family. He lived in Port Gibson, which had been taken by the Federals. So his family was under Union occupation. He had no way of knowing what had happened to them, so I can only imagine what his anxiety must have been like, knowing his wife and 3 small children were basically in enemy territory. And he would not know for over 47 days, what had happened to them. So I just only can imagine how distressed he must have been, not knowing what had happened to his family. His next entry is on May 19th, and he wrote, "Skirmishing brisk part of the night. Hard fighting anticipated today. 10 o'clock. Skirmishing in front of our lines. Some heavy pieces firing on our left from our side. 45 minutes past 6. We have fought the enemy very hard today and held our positions well along the line. It is with deep regret I have to record the wounding of 3 of my company. Sergeant M.W. Payne, Privates Lathrop and Middleton. I am proud to have it said of that my company behaved nobly. Reports say the enemy's loss is very heavy on the left of our line. I thank Almighty God for his protection through the last days. The fight commenced about 1 o'clock. And this fighting that he's talking about was Grant's first assault on the Vicksburg defenses on May 19th, and it was repulsed with fairly heavy Union casualties. Of the men that Faulk mentions in his diary on this day, Second Sergeant Milton W. Payne was wounded on May 19th. He survived his wound and returned to the 38th Mississippi, only to be killed in the Battle of Harrisburg, Mississippi on July 14, 1864. Private J.P. Lathrop enlisted as a substitute for another man in August of 1862. His service record states simply, "Wounded May 19th, since died." And then Private Martin V. Middleton, who was wounded on May 19th, was paroled with the regiment at Vicksburg. After the surrender of Vicksburg, he never returned to the regiment, and he was listed as absent without leave. And this picture shown here is another one that I took out in the military park, and it's showing the terrain out in front of the 38th Mississippi's position. And unfortunately, most of their position, or the area out in front of it, is obscured today by trees. There's only a very small portion of the area out in front of their position that you can see a little bit of a distance. And it was over this terrain that the Union soldiers of Ransom's brigade attacked during the May 19th assault. On May 20th, Faulk recorded the following entry in his diary. 5 o'clock a.m., skirmishing along our lines, sharpshooting and artillery firing incessant since morning up to this time. 10 o'clock, Adjutant Ward wounded in both legs by a sharpshooter. 6 o'clock p.m., firing heavy in the right since 2 o'clock and on the left since 4 o'clock. I am certain we have held our position all along the line. We have not been engaged up to this time, but have been under a heavy fire from sharpshooters and in range of the firing on the left. 5 or 6 men in the regiment wounded and 1 killed from Company I. Reports have had General Johnston coming to our assistance for some days. Hope he may come soon, but our men seem confident of holding Vicksburg. 1 man from my company slightly wounded. D.Y. Legist. I forgot to mention yesterday the wounding of Lieutenant Lanehart, said to be mortal. He was a good officer and popular with his fellow officers. In him the regiment has lost a good officer. Night has set in, and with it grateful feelings. I return thanks to God for his protection and victory to our arms for this day. Spirited conversation between the pickets along the line. And just as a note, the adjutant ward that Faulk mentions in this entry was actually Adjutant William Lynch Ware, who was listed as severely wounded on May 20th, 1863. After recovering from his wounds, he did return to the regiment, only to be wounded again at the Battle of Harrisburg, Mississippi on July 14, 1864. He recovered from this injury as well and returned to the regiment, surrendering in May of 1865 when the regiment surrendered. The D.Y. legist that Faulk mentions was actually David T. Segrist, who his service record notes that he was wounded on May 20th slightly. Lieutenant Lanehart, who was also mentioned, was First Lieutenant Hansford Lanehart, who was a member of Company D of the 38th Mississippi, the Wilkinson Guards from Wilkinson County. Lanehart commanded the regiment's skirmishers on May 19th, and he was out in front of the main line of entrenchments with those skirmishers when the Federals attacked. As the men retreated back into the works, Lanehart was struck by an enemy bullet and mortally wounded. He was the first casualty of the 38th Mississippi during the siege of Vicksburg. And on May 21st, Faulk recorded, "Heavy skirmishing along the right of our lines and some opposite us. It is hard to say what the program is for the day. 6 o'clock. Nothing done along the lines today except brisk skirmishing. We hold our positions well. None hurt in the regiment today, for which we are thankful to God." And the image I show here is just a great woodcut engraving. I just really like it because I think it gives you a good sense of what it must have been like to be out there. This is taken from the perspective of the Federal lines, and this illustration was actually done by A.E. Matthews, who was a member of the 31st Ohio Volunteer Infantry. And it shows the position of his regiment, which is part of General Hovey's division. On May 22nd, Faulk recorded the following. He said, "Heavy artillery firing during the night and up to 8 o'clock this morning. 7 o'clock p.m., the enemy made a desperate charge on the line commencing about 10:30 o'clock and was kept up around the lines until dark. The enemy made tremendous exertions to force our lines, but with God's assistance we have been able to hold it. Only 2 companies in our regiment have been engaged today, my company and Company E. 1 man from my company badly wounded, Private I. Ritchie. 3 men killed in the regiment and 3 wounded. The enemy's loss was certainly great. We are nearly worn out lying in the entrenchments. Gunboats shelling Vicksburg." And in fact, this illustration is a great illustration of Union mortar boats firing into Vicksburg during the siege. These were huge guns. These were 13-inch siege mortars. They were firing a 200-pound shell into the city, and they fired thousands of these into Vicksburg. They were not a very accurate weapon, but they were just a way of making movement and making the people inside the city miserable during the siege, because they could throw a ball into the city from quite a long distance away. They were probably several miles off from the city firing those things in. And like I said, they did fire thousands of them into the city of Vicksburg during the siege. And just to give you an idea, here, this is a piece of a 13-inch siege mortar shell that has exploded. I picked this up in Vicksburg some years ago, down in a little creek where it washed out. This is just a small chunk, and it probably weighs a good, I'd say, 15 pounds, maybe more. And you can just imagine the kind of damage one of these things would do when it hits something like a building or any kind of solid structure. It's a massive piece of iron. And on the May 22nd, Grant had made his second attempt to storm the entrenchments at Vicksburg. It was a very powerful assault, but it was again repulsed with extremely heavy casualties on the Union side, so the Confederate lines did hold. Now, Faulk was incorrect when he stated that only his company and Company E of the 38th were engaged. Now, he probably, all he could see was his company and perhaps one other. He just didn't realize that the rest of the company was engaged as well, because but they definitely were. The casualties that the regiment took were spread equally throughout the 10 companies of the 38th, and it's just a matter of Faulk being so busy with his company he couldn't really tell what was going on with the rest of the regiment. But the Private I. Ritchie that Faulk mentioned was Isaac Ritchie, who had been captured in Oxford, Mississippi in December of 62, paroled at City Point, Virginia in April of 63. He made it back to the 38th Mississippi just in time to take part in the Vicksburg campaign. And his service record notes that he was wounded May 22nd, since died. And the next day, on May 23rd, Faulk recorded in his diary, all very quiet along the lines tonight up to the present time, 6 o'clock, except some sharpshooting. We are called upon to regret the loss of Captain Gravis. He was killed early this morning by a sharpshooter. He was a clever man and a good officer. 5 o'clock p.m. All has been quiet along the lines up to this time. They have commenced heavy shelling and will keep it up till dark. 6 o'clock. 4 men wounded in our regiment, 1 severely. 1 from my company, George Burford, slightly. The enemy have planted artillery in many places, and we may look for heavy shelling. We are having many men wounded, principally from shells. Tomorrow will be Sunday, and we may look for hot work. And just a note, the Captain Gravis that he mentioned was actually Captain Leander M. Graves, who was the commander of Company F of the 38th. And his service record, again, just simply states killed May 23rd. The Private George H. Buford, who was recorded as being wounded, it must have been a very slight wound because his service record doesn't even make note of it. And on May 24th, the diary continues with 8 o'clock a.m. All quiet this morning except the sharpshooting on both sides. Had my company at work all night throwing up embankments to prevent the enfilading fire from the enemy. Today is Sunday, the day usually selected for fighting. We can hear nothing very reliable from our reinforcements. Major McKay is very sick at the hospital. Lieutenant Smith went to the hospital sick yesterday. 7 o'clock p.m. Today has been unusually quiet. Sharpshooting and artillery firing all day. No one hurt in our regiment. Sunday has been more quiet than usual, and when you take into consideration that 2 armies are lying so near to each other. We thank God for his continued protection of our lines. And the Major McKay that Faulk mentions was Major Robert C. McKay, who was 3rd in command of the 38th Mississippi Infantry. This is a picture of him in the inset picture here, along with a copy of McKay's parole document when the siege of Vicksburg ended. And McKay survived the siege of Vicksburg, only to be killed at the Battle of Harrisburg, Mississippi, July 14, 1864. The Lieutenant Smith that Faulk also mentioned was 2nd Lieutenant Stephen F. Smith of Company B. And on May 25th, William Faulk made the following entry into his diary. He said, "All quiet this morning. Nothing heard but the firing of sharpshooters, and occasionally they throw in a few shells, but do very little harm. 1 man killed in Company D by a sharpshooter this morning. Shelling in Vicksburg from gunboats very severe. 4 o'clock. The enemy have sent in a flag of truce to bury their dead, which was granted. Hostilities on both sides ceased during the time. It was a grand sight to see such 2 large armies within speaking distance of each other and in full view, many conversing with each other, seemingly very friendly." In fact, this illustration is entitled "Burying the Dead at Vicksburg." It's from Osborne Oldroyd's book, The Simple Story of a Soldier. He was a federal soldier in the 20th Ohio Infantry. If you've never read his memoir, it's extremely good. It's a very good account by a Union soldier of his service during the Civil War, and I highly recommend it. But the entry goes on to conclude, Their dead, many of them, have been lying on the field 3 and 4 days. Such are the horrors of war. One poor fellow was picked up last night who had been wounded 2 days before. What must have been his sufferings? Night has set in, and the time allowed the enemy to bury their dead is past. It has been a period of recreation for us all. We've been permitted to come from the ditches and walk around and relieved from the continuous firing of the sharpshooters and cannon. But it will soon be resumed, to continue, I suppose, until there is another lot to bury. How tiresome it is to lead such a life, and what is worse, not able to hear from our loved ones at home. It has been about 3 weeks since I heard anything definite from them. May God protect them and watch over them. So even with everything that was going on, I think Faulk was more concerned with his family than he was about his own safety. He was in the middle of one of the most intense sieges of the entire war, but first and foremost on his mind was his wife and his children. And on May 26th, Faulk wrote the following. He said, "This is a quiet spring morning. All nature seems at peace, but this terrible war is still going on. Our men are all cheerful and are determined to contend for what they believe to be their sacred rights. One man killed accidentally or by mistake while on picket by a man from the 7th Mississippi Battalion. He belonged to Company C of our regiment. 5:30 o'clock. No charge made by the enemy today. All quiet except occasional firing by cannon and continuous sharpshooting. I regret the wounding of one of my best men, Louis Segrist, who was shot just below the knee, causing a fracture of one of the bones. Also, one man from Company E wounded at the spring while getting water. 6:30 o'clock. Night is fast approaching. Firing still continues, principally from the enemy's guns. 9 days we have been confined to the ditches, only permitted to walk around after dark. All worried and tired, but still determined to endure all for what we believe to be our rights, and confident that an overruling providence will work all for our good. The enemy may be a superior force, overcome us for a short time, but God will never favor the persecutors of innocent women and children. They have passed by my home, and I cried to hear the condition in which I fear they have left my wife and children." And shown here, this is a map. This is by Hal Jesperson, who does just amazing maps. You can see a lot of his work online, and he does some really amazing stuff. But this shows the siege lines of Vicksburg. The Confederate siege lines are in red, and then the Union lines are paralleling them are in blue. But the 38th Mississippi was located just south of the Stockade Redan. And on May 27th, Faulk made this entry in his diary. He said, "Another beautiful morning has rolled around, and still the popping of guns from sharpshooters continues, and the occasional peals from the enemy's cannon. We will all rejoice when we can leave these ditches, but if we can save Vicksburg by it, we are willing to remain here for weeks. No one can tell what a day may bring forth. 3 o'clock. Heavy firing on the river this morning. One of the enemy's gunboats, a heavy ironclad turreted boat, came within range of our batteries and was sunk by our guns. Lieutenant Harrington went to the hospital today. The incessant sharpshooting still continues." And the gunboat that Faulk was referring to actually was not turreted. It was one of the City-class gunboats, as they're now known, the USS Cincinnati, shown in this picture here. And it was sunk by Confederate artillery fire from the river, some of the river batteries on May 27th. And the boat was sunk. Most of the survivors were either captured or some managed to make it back to Union lines. But after the siege, the Federals raised the boat, put it back into service. This was actually the second time that the Cincinnati had been sunk. It had been sunk before, and it had been put back into service. It's really amazing the feats of engineering that they could do during the war. But the Lieutenant Harrington that Faulk mentioned in his diary on this day was First Lieutenant E.T. Harrington of Company B. And on May 28th, Faulk recorded, No attack has been made on our lines. 7 o'clock. Nothing unusual has happened today. The enemy still continue their shelling and sharpshooting. Johnston is reported to be in Canton on his way here. We will try very hard to hold Vicksburg until he arrives. God still continues to watch over our little army, and I trust will finally deliver us from our troubles. And then the next day he recorded 6 o'clock. Very heavy artillery firing from the enemy this morning. We may have a warm time of it today. God be with us. 4 o'clock. No fighting today so far. It seems to be their determination to starve us out and besiege the city. From 5 o'clock until dark, the enemy's cannonading was tremendous. They opened their guns on us, but no one was hurt that I heard of. And it was just a hailstorm of artillery fire that was being thrown into Vicksburg. This image, this is just a portion of the artillery that the Federals captured when Vicksburg surrendered. You can imagine all of these hundreds of guns, which the Federals had, I think, somewhere along the lines of 200 artillery pieces firing into Vicksburg during the siege. And the amount of ordnance they threw into the city was just amazing. In August of 1863, the New York Times published a synopsis of the Union expenditure of artillery rounds during the siege of Vicksburg. Lieutenant Colonel William L. Duff, Ulysses S. Grant's chief of artillery, provided this estimate, and he stated that during the 47-day siege, the Union artillery fired 9,598 rounds during the May 19th assault, 10,754 rounds during the May 22nd assault, and for the remainder of the siege, 111,614 rounds of artillery during the siege. And this averaged out to about 653 rounds fired by each Union artillery piece during the siege, which is just an amazing amount of ordnance. And just to give you an idea of how many men it took to man just one artillery battery, which an artillery battery was typically made up of 6 guns. These are the guns and the men that would have served these guns all in one picture. And this is not taken at Vicksburg. This is a photo of Company M of the 2nd U.S. Light Artillery, but it does give you a good idea of just how many men and horses it took to keep one battery of artillery in the field. But on May 30th, Faulk had written, "We expected an attack last night and had all things prepared, but the night has passed off, and this morning the sharpshooters are popping away as usual, but we may have it today. We have now been in the ditches 14 days. For 2 weeks have the enemy been hammering at the gates of Vicksburg, and still she refuses to open for them. 7 o'clock. Heavy artillery firing this evening, but so far has heard no casualties. Another day has passed and Vicksburg is still ours. The confidence and determination of the troops seems to grow stronger every day. We will hold our hill city, cost what it may, with God's assistance." And then the next day he recorded, "The enemy opened on us with a tremendous artillery fire, commencing about 2:30 o'clock a.m. As usual, no damage done. 'Tis the Sabbath again. My desire is to be at my quiet home for a few short minutes. Seems greater than ever to be rid of this everlasting firing." 6:30 p.m. Today has passed off unusually quiet. 1 man wounded in our regiment slightly. We came into the ditches. Tonight will be 2 weeks ago. We are all very tired, but will hold out as long as there is a possible chance to save our city. And as the 1st of June dawned, Faulk wrote the following in his diary. He said, "Some artillery firing last night opposite our lines. Heavy on the right about 3 o'clock. Shell burst in Company A last night just after dark, killing 3 men and wounding 2. Their provisions had just come in and they were sitting around eating their suppers when a shell exploded in their midst, showing just how little we know of the uncertainty of life. 6 o'clock. Nothing unusual has occurred today. Nothing unusual. Enemy shelling rapidly this evening. When will this tedious siege come to an end? Our men still continue cheerful under their slim fare of one ration per day and other hardships. No late news from Johnston. And then the next day, 7 o'clock. Brisk firing of musketry about 12 o'clock last night on our right. We expected a charge from the enemy. All quiet again this morning except the usual sharpshooting and occasional cannonading. 5:30 p.m. Very heavy shelling from the enemy at present and for the last half hour, but doing no harm that I can hear of. Today so far has been about as quiet as usual. 100 of the enemy's pickets reported to have been captured last night on our right by General Greene. We thank God there has been no casualties today. And on June 3rd, a change was in store for the regiment, and Faulk recorded this in his diary. He said on June 3rd, "We were moved last night to a position toward the right. The men very much dissatisfied with the change. Everything more quiet than usual this morning. 7 o'clock. Shelling has been very heavy today, and we again return thanks to God that no one has been hurt. I have just heard of the death of one of my wounded men in the hospital, Louis Segrist. He was killed by the explosion of a shell while lying in a tent near the hospital. We all mourn his loss in him. We have lost a brave soldier and his community a good citizen." And the men of the 38th had a good reason to complain about their new position in the line. And this picture shows where they were moved. They were moved into a position that protected the Jackson Road entrance into the city of Vicksburg. And the regiment's line of entrenchments is marked in this modern photograph by the red marker that's to the right of the Jackson Road. This position was a lot more exposed than their previous position. It was a lot more dangerous position because the Federals had more artillery brought to bear on this part of the line, and also the Federal sharpshooters had a much better aim at the Confederates in the trenches here, and so life was going to be very difficult for the men of the 38th for the remainder of the siege because they were in a hot spot. And on June 4th, Faulk recorded, "Heavy firing on the right last night, cause not known. 7:30 o'clock. Shells falling all around us. Nothing but providential interference has saved some of our company from being killed, our position being more exposed than the other companies. 7 o'clock p.m. But little firing from the cannon today compared to other days." June 5th. "Nothing has occurred today worth mentioning. The usual amount of shelling and cannonading has been done, but we have great cause to be very thankful to Almighty God that no one in our regiment has been hurt for several days." June 6th. "One man from Company I shot in the finger by a sharpshooter last night. Less firing from cannon this morning than usual." 7 o'clock. "Today has been very quiet. Many reports about General Johnston, but nothing reliable." And at this point, I am going to call a halt to part one. This is going to be a two-part episode because it is the diary is fairly lengthy. I hope you enjoyed this first part. I will be coming back with the second part hopefully tomorrow. I'm trying to get this done close around the time of the surrender of Vicksburg. But if you like this video, please give it a like. If you have any comments, please leave them. Or if you have any questions, if you'll leave them in the comments, I'll be happy to answer them. But I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and thank you very much for watching.